Hey, what's up everybody? This is Mike Riley and today's video is all about weed DUIs. Marijuana use is widespread throughout the United States. About half of the states have legalized marijuana for recreational purposes, and about 80% allow the use of marijuana for medicinal purposes. So in today's video, we're gonna dive right in and talk about a lot of the issues that come up when we're discussing weed DUIs. You can expect to learn the difference between a weed DUI and a traditional alcohol-related DUI. You're going to learn about the different tactics that law enforcement uses to try and establish that somebody is driving under the influence of marijuana. And I'm going to talk a little bit about emerging technology, things we can expect to see come from cops that they're going to try and use to establish that people are operating under the influence. And lastly, I'm going to talk about the number one thing that you should never ever do if you want to avoid getting a weed DUI. So first, it goes without saying, I am not advocating that anybody operate a vehicle under the influence of marijuana. I think it would be a really, really bad idea. You're putting yourself at risk. You're putting other drivers on the road at risk. DUIs can really make your life difficult. They can involve mandatory jail time, license suspension, probation, drug tests. You do not want to get a DUI. If you can avoid it, you should avoid it. Not to mention the fact that if you do get a DUI, you're going to have to pay someone like me a lot of money to represent you in court. And certainly you have better things that you can do with your money. But I do think it's worth noting that law enforcement faces some real challenges when trying to prove these cases in court. It's also important to note that weed DUIs are handled differently in different states. In the majority of states, you could be convicted of a weed DUI only when it can be established in court that you were under the influence of marijuana at the time that you were driving. However, there is a small group of states, maybe about 10 states, that have a zero tolerance policy with respect to weed DUIs. In these states, if you have marijuana or THC metabolites in your system, that alone could be enough to convict you of a weed DUI. And in this video, I'm going to talk about issues that come up in cases in the majority of states where you need to establish that someone who's actually under the influence at the time that they were driving to convict them of a weed DUI. Let's talk about some of the evidence that cops gather and that prosecutors use in court to try and establish that somebody is operating under the influence. And the evidence really falls into three categories. We're talking about the police officer's own observations, what they smelled, what they heard, what they saw. We're talking about field sobriety tests. These are standardized tests administered by cops to try and detect if someone is under the influence. And lastly, police officers rely on chemical tests, breathalyzers, urinalysis, and blood tests to determine what was in somebody's system at the time that they were driving. So again, like a traditional DUI, the police officer would come up to the window of the vehicle that they've just stopped, and they're going to note their observations in a police report. Now, red bloodshot eyes, we would expect to see that in a weed DUI the same way we would in a traditional alcohol-related DUI. But what we don't expect to see is the slurred speech, because people who are under the influence of marijuana generally are not slurring their speech. An officer could argue that they smell the odor of marijuana in the vehicle, and that can be used to support a suggestion that someone is operating under the influence of marijuana. But again, unburned marijuana also smells, so I think the cop would have to distinguish between unburned and burned marijuana. Unburned marijuana in the car, that doesn't suggest that somebody who's smoking it, they might just be in possession of it. And again, about half the states, that's totally legal, not a crime, so it doesn't really matter. So I think with respect to the observations of the officer, that's the most similar to the alcohol-related DUIs, because there are observations that a cop can make that would support a finding that someone is under the influence. But it's not the strongest evidence. And this is why police officers generally want more. They want the field sobriety test. They want the chemical tests, because it goes beyond just an officer's observations. So next, let's talk about the standard field sobriety test. And here's where we start to see the challenges presented by a weed DUI. So first, the horizontal gaze nystagmus test. A cop is going to ask somebody to follow their finger, and they're going to look for that involuntary jerking of the eye. Nystagmus is not going to present the same way in somebody who's under the influence of marijuana that it does with somebody who's under the influence of alcohol. That cue is not going to be there. So that test is less indicative of marijuana intoxication as it is alcohol intoxication. Next, we talk about the walk and turn test. Somebody who's under the influence of marijuana is going to be able to walk a straight line, turn around and walk back without swaying, falling off. Marijuana generally is not going to impact your motor skills or your coordination the same way alcohol would. So this test is less valuable to law enforcement when trying to establish that somebody is under the influence of marijuana. It just doesn't tell them much. And the same thing goes with the one-legged stand test. Somebody could be very much under the influence of marijuana and be able to stand on one foot without swaying, without falling over. And this can be distinguished from somebody who's under the influence of alcohol is going to have trouble balancing. So that test is less valuable to cops when trying to establish that somebody's under the influence of weed. So now let's talk a little bit about chemical tests. And the one we see most frequently when we're talking about an alcohol-related DUI is the breathalyzer. Cops can quantify exactly what somebody's blood alcohol level is. A 0.08, a 0.15, a 0.35, whatever it may be, they could pinpoint it, and that's compelling evidence in court. That offers no value to law enforcement when we're talking about a weed DUI. A breathalyzer is not going to detect that somebody's under the influence of marijuana. In fact, you could be high as a kite, take a breathalyzer, and get a 0.0. So the breathalyzer really does nothing for cops trying to gather evidence that somebody's under the influence of marijuana. Next, we could talk about urine test. The urine just tells you what was in their system. The urine shows what has been eliminated from the body. So just because you have something in your urine doesn't mean that you're under the influence of it. And the same thing goes with blood. Blood can show that somebody has marijuana in their system, but it doesn't tell us whether or not they're under the influence of marijuana. So if someone smokes a joint, yeah, maybe they're high for 2 hours, 3 hours, something like that, but they're going to test positive maybe for the next month. So if a police officer suspects that somebody is driving under the influence of marijuana and takes a blood test and finds out, yes, there are marijuana or THC metabolites in this person's system, it does not mean that they were actually under the influence of marijuana at the time that they got caught driving. So again, I think that chemical tests don't offer much to cops when trying to establish that someone was under the influence of marijuana. So what are cops doing to try and combat these challenges presented by weed DUIs? One thing that they're doing is employing the use of drug recognition experts, or DREs. These are essentially cops who go to specialized training to determine, to identify if someone is under the influence of a particular drug. And this is largely based on observations that we talked about already. They're looking at the pupil size, are the eyes bloodshot, are there impaired motor skills, a lack of coordination, things like this. And these officers are generally permitted to come into court and testify that they made certain observations that are consistent with marijuana intoxication. So as with any other witness, these DREs, or drug recognition experts, are subject to cross-examination. A good lawyer can get in there and explain on cross that there could be reasons why someone has bloodshot eyes that are not consistent with intoxication. There are reasons why somebody's pupils may be bigger or smaller that is not consistent with intoxication. So yes, you absolutely could be convicted of a DUI based on a drug recognition expert coming to court and testifying that what they observed about your behavior when you're behind the wheel was consistent with marijuana intoxication. But with cross-examination, perhaps you could chop them down and argue that they weren't credible or what they saw wasn't really intoxication. Going forward, what I expect cops to do is lean into some emerging technologies, specifically with respect to saliva tests. We're seeing cops use saliva tests now to try and determine if someone is under the influence of marijuana. So basically what this is a cheek swab. The officers swab your cheek on the side of the road and they get a reading. Is there marijuana in this person's system? Again, I think there are issues with this. These tests are generally showing whether somebody had marijuana in their system within the last 24 to 48 hours. And I don't think that's enough to prove that they were under the influence at the time that they were driving. But there is one way you absolutely could get yourself charged with a weed DUI. I can't tell you how many times I've seen a case where somebody is driving down the road, smoking a joint, smoking a blunt. The cop sees them doing it, pulls them over, boom, weed DUI. You're burning one in the car. What is a lawyer going to do to defend that? The only thing we could do is maybe argue that they didn't have a basis to stop you and that any evidence that they gathered after stopping you should be suppressed, but that's a long shot. If they catch you smoking in the car, you're dead in the water with a DUI and you're going to have to deal with it. So just don't do it. Like, wait till you get home, smoke when you get home. It's just a better idea. I know some people think it's fun to drive around and smoke in the car, but it's a really, really bad idea, especially with law enforcement being more vigilant, looking to pinch people for weed DUIs. I think it's a really bad idea and it's something that you should avoid. Anyway, let me know what you think. I'd love to hear your thoughts and comments below. If there's anything else you want to hear me talk about, please let me know and stay tuned for more videos. Thanks a lot.